Mike, your bike's rattling.
I know, it's so rattly.
What the hell is that?
I don't know. I think it might be the cables or something. Like, it doesn't have thin pads.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Hello and welcome to the Field Test 2024 in Whistler. This year it's all about those trail bikes, 140, 150 mil of travel. And this is the 150 mil travel Transition Sentinel, which is paired to a 160 mil fork. It weighs 32 pounds and 5 ounces, which means something to someone, presumably somewhere, even if I don't really know what that means. Now this bike is full carbon, full 29, and it's got a lot of the mod cons that you might expect, such as internal frame storage. It supposedly can go to mixed wheels. However, I would say that flip chip doesn't offer as much swing as some of the other bikes on test. Now, in Transition's copy, they say it's for a seasoned mountain biker, as well as beginners. And if the seasoning comment is true, that probably explains why some Pinkbike commenters are just so damn salty. But what did we think of this bike and how did we get on in the 2 weeks we were giving it a damn good thrashing? Well, let's start off with our first impressions.
My cables are rattling. It's a little dusty back here. But pretty good and composed. Like, pretty supportive. The old Sentinel tune could sometimes be a little tricky. This one feels got a nice spot. Feel like the travel's there, but I'm not blowing through it, which is nice. This bike feels not like nimble wouldn't be the word I'd use. Feels more solid, like it's easy to change directions, but a little bit longer back end. It does feel nice and composed. You know, this is rough, chunky stuff. I'm sucking it up. It's just a little harder to scoop it up and off the ground.
You've now heard our first impressions. We're gonna get into some questions and talk a little bit more about the Sentinel.
Whoa, watch your eyes. What do we got?
Good throw. All right.
First are 3 words: muted, composed, and medium.
All right, I think it was Mike who had the first impression on this bike. Muted, composed, and medium. Muted, I don't necessarily think that came across in the end. I think that the suspension feels quiet and audibly is quiet. Like the RockShox stuff makes no noise and felt, once you got it set up right, pretty like cushy and not too reactive.
Yeah.
But I think the bike itself made a good amount of noise between the drivetrain and a couple other little knocks that came up here and there.
It wasn't the loudest, but it certainly wasn't the quietest bike. And yeah, I would agree, you can set up this bike in sort of 2 different ways to be muted and composed, but then also compose at like higher speeds too, with a firmer suspension setup. And then the medium, yeah, I would agree to that word in the way that it was like balanced. I thought that the front and rear centers of the bike were pretty well aligned, and I always felt like I was in the middle of the bike, never like lurching over the front or the back, and that wasn't the case some of the other bikes showed.
Yeah, I found getting to composed and medium to be a bit more challenging in terms of suspension setup. I played a lot with settings to find that kind of balanced feel that I was looking for, but did eventually get there. And I think part of it is like the geometry. It has a pretty long rear center. Part of it is the suspension characteristic of the bike as well.
I did have an issue with the components, like the drivetrain. I found like really clunky, and this bike in particular was similar to the Rocky actually. They just kind of, I just felt like my weight was always like oscillating as I'm like trying to put weight into the bike and like push the cranks down and then like stay light and hop over things on the way up. It was just, there was a lot of movement even though I was in the middle of the bike and still centered. So,
you know, I dive into components quickly. It's worth noting that this bike comes with like an 18 tooth DT ratchet, which is the lowest count they make. And you have like a really noticeable gap between points of engagement. If you're just humming along, it's no issue. But if you're trying to like ratchet up a kind of punchy climb, put power down between bits of descent, you do notice that lurch.
That like lag.
All right, you want to jump into the first question?
Right. Climbing, very long chain stays, how was it on the climbs?
So yeah, depending on how you measure the Rocky Instinct, the Sentinel is the longest rear end on test. Our size has 448 mil stays. I think that really helps on steeper and more technical climbs. I think it keeps weight on the rear wheel, it keeps your front end down, and that bike has a ton of traction, so you kind of just like spin and motor up steeper stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, 448 with a size large, they do change up per size a little bit. But yeah, I found it to be quite balanced, and I felt like I was riding in the center of the bike. It also has like a fairly, even with the bars, a little bit lower on the steer tube. I felt like I was, like I had my hands were up high and I was kind of in the bike, but also centered. And it doesn't make for the most like dynamic, agile bike, but you can just kind of tractor over everything.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's encouraging you to like sprint up anything, but you can just kind of plod along and get through stuff pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because it's got traction and composure.
It's not too heavy either, like it felt light to ride. Question number 2, the Sentinel has 165 cranks. Those are a little shorter than the rest on the test. Also a high bottom bracket. How does that come into play with the suspension and everything else?
Yeah, it looks like we'll get into the sag element of this bike in the next question, but suffice to say that you can run this with quite a bit of sag, and I think the component choice of shorter cranks and the geometry choice of a higher bottom bracket cater towards that a little bit. I found that on any sort of chunky climbs, you're really able to just pedal through it a bit more than you were on the other bikes. It's not a natural feeling because I think until you get really used to a bike, you tend to avoid pedaling through really chunky things. You try to pick spots where it's more natural, but if you're someone who likes to just spin through things, this is a good bike for that.
Yeah, I mean, we see that on e-bikes. They go to shorter cranks, so you can kind of keep the wheels turning as opposed to like making those ratchet moves with longer cranks, which might hang up. And then, yeah, that definitely plays into question number 3, is how does that coincide with running a higher sag? And I think drawing comparisons between this and the Rocky are really good because the Rocky sort of starts with a very active suspension and lower BB, and the Sentinel is pretty progressive as well. So you run a lot of sag, but you're starting higher. So it kind of puts you in a better position for climbing once the bike is sagged.
Yeah, you could really fundamentally change the characteristic of how this bike sat ride height wise based on the sag you're running. And obviously that's the case with any bike. You can change sag, but I think because it tends to ride higher by the geometry and component choice on this bike, it's worth pushing outside of like the normal envelope of sag that you'd run on a trail bike and maybe running something a bit higher. Get it more seated, more settled, basically is what I'm aiming for. All right, first question on the descents. Transition specs this bike as being able to run between 27 and 33% sag. It's printed right on the back of the C-tube. Where did you end up in that bracket?
For me, it depended on what we were riding. Like Whistler, we've got bike park trails. They're fast, they're groomed, but there's also some techie, slower stuff. So for the bike park stuff, I'd go a little bit higher spring rate, so firmer, and then back that off a little bit if we were riding like west side, super techie chunk trails. And that gives you good grip, but then it's progressive enough so that it doesn't encounter those harsh bottom outs.
Yeah.
Did you find the same? Were you changing it up? Or?
I stuck to the higher end of the sag range, so I was running like 33% pretty consistently, even in the bike park. Okay. I just liked the way the bike sat more. I think the bottom bracket felt a bit high if I was on the lower end of that sag range, and just kind of made the balance a little bit funkier feeling. It's worth noting too that you can obviously play with the sag numbers on any bike, but Transition makes a point of that being like an explicit part of setup with these, is that you can really change that to change the characteristic. Jump into the second question. We've got, where might you differ that setup? I mean, you kind of spoke to that.
Yeah.
You've got west side versus bike park.
Yeah.
I think terrain matters a lot here, but your bottom bracket height's going to change dynamically quite a bit depending on where you end up in that sag setup. I think too, this bike settles more on that higher end of the sag range. It doesn't feel quite as reactive.
Yep.
To me, that's a big part of the calculus with where you'd end up in that spectrum.
Okay. When you say it like kind of like dives down a little bit, but then like kind of floats on like.
Yeah, I ran it with like a bit more damping, a higher sag number, and found that it just settled nicely into a spot where I could kind of react and pump the bike without feeling harsh bottom outs or feeling too chattery off the top.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes back to the way I agreed with the setup too.
Yeah.
And then number 3, what do we got?
Does the flip chip make sense?
Well, yeah, there is a flip chip. We got the bike as a dual 29er. The bike was set up in the low mode. If you flip it to the high, it's meant to be for a 27.5 rear wheel. I ran it exclusively in the low because it felt best there. Like I didn't feel the need to go to the high. We mentioned sort of that contrasting, like, you know, greater sag amount, but then higher static BB and how those sort of level out. What about you?
To me, the low mode feels like it should be called the high mode, and then there's one below that. And again, I was playing with sag to try to get the bottom bracket lower on this bike, just to try to get front and rear balance a bit better.
Yeah.
And I liked it, like it felt fine to me, but it would be interesting if there was an even, like a step below. And I think part of it is just the BB offset on this bike is a bit less than some of the others. It's 25 mil offset, where some of the other trail bikes are pushing into like the 40 range. So not to say that one's right, one's wrong. I just found that for my preferences on a bike like this, I like a lower bottom bracket, and it kind of conforms to the terrain a bit better. It doesn't feel quite as like perched on top.
Yeah, I could see that, I guess, depending on how you set up the fork and balance that with the rear shock.
Yeah, for sure. Question number 4, does this bike feel balanced?
I think I might be the standout here. I thought it felt balanced both in terms of like front and rear center, like the length of the bike. And depending on how I set it up, I could feel pretty comfy on it. But you, Kaz, and Henry all felt a little different about this, hey?
Yeah, I found it had a tendency to seesaw quite a bit, where you'd feel your weight shifting between front and rear, and that wasn't the case on a lot of the other bikes. I think part of it was the rather long chain stays. And the highish bottom bracket felt like it wanted to pitch you forward until you found a suspension setup that was maybe too soft for some things, but sat you into the bike a bit more.
Yeah, so what type of trail did that happen on?
Things that were really steep. Like we went and rode some loamers yesterday where you're like riding the brakes a lot and hitting bumps, and I found in those it was pitching forward more than I wanted it to. You could set up for that, but then it would maybe start to suffer in some flatter, more like reactive trail riding.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to like the bike park versus tech trail setup that I mentioned.
Yeah.
I did find, if you're running it softer, on the softer side, it would do that lurch thing, especially on the brakes. And that's maybe one thing we find with those FSR designs, hey?
Yeah, a little bit. And I think there's an element of, all these bikes are going to benefit from setup changes depending on how you're riding them, but this one to me maybe felt a bit more sensitive to that. Like you really had to be like, okay, this is my setup for these sorts of things, for these sorts of trails. I'm going to change that because we're going to go hit a jump line kind of thing.
Gotcha.
Not drastically, but just, tweaks here and there. All right, 5th question. The takeaways, is this bike cool and who is it for?
I think it is a cool bike. I mean, it falls in line with the rest of Transition sort of looks. They're clean, they're cut. They've got the storage box now.
We didn't even mention that. Yeah, it has in-frame storage, which is a first for Transition.
I mean, we didn't have any issues with it. It didn't seem like overly loud. You fit, the average amount of stuff in there.
Yeah.
All your supplies. But then I also think it's good because you can set it up in a bunch of different ways. You can actually take a travel spacer out of the shock and bump it up to 160 travel. You can also run it as a mullet bike. And so it's pretty adaptable, but I think there's still going to be those sort of setbacks in setting it up. You might have to run it through sort of a system to dial in the suspension.
Yeah, I think what's cool about how Transition approaches frame design is you can turn a lot of their bikes into a variety of different things. I think this is maybe their most normal and central bike in that way. Like the Sentinel's always been this middle kind of do it all sort of bike. This one feels maybe less that way than the last one did to me. I think it's a bit more focused on something. I don't really know what necessarily, but because the geo gets a little more extreme. They made the head angle actually steeper on this bike, but because the rear center gets a lot longer, it starts to feel more like it's meant for high speed stuff. I don't think it's confused by any means. It's just going to be a bit more work to get it set up in a ton of different ways if you're someone who wants to play with that.
Yeah, it's hard to be the master of all,
For sure.
And then I guess I could mention it does have 6 sizes.
True, yeah, super wide size range.
Yeah.
So it does fit a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it can fit a lot of different terrain and types of trail, but
Yeah.
maybe takes a little bit more work to get there.
Those are our thoughts on the Sentinel. We're gonna go see how it is to live with Henry in the garage.
So behind me, we have the Sentinel, and let's talk about how easy it is to live with. The first thing we're going to talk about is the noise. Now, to be honest, a lot of these bikes on this test haven't been as quiet as we would have liked, and the Sentinel suffers from the same issue. Mainly, it's that cable inside the frame. Even though there's a clamp at the entry, it does feel like there's some rattling going on there, and you can definitely hear that out on the trail. The second thing we're going to talk about is the stroke length of the rear shock. Now, in its stock guise, it's at 60mm, but if you wanted to overstroke the bike and get more rear wheel travel, you could bump that up to 65mm by removing an internal spacer. This isn't something that's going to be for everyone, but it could be a way to add some more versatility to the bike. Another thing we want to talk about is this storage solution is good to have, but it does feel quite cheap and flimsy. It might not necessarily lead you to any issues, and the fact that the water bottle isn't mounted off it certainly makes it a bit quieter, but it is worth considering. Finally, the bar is quite high at 40mm. Now, that is offset somewhat by the fact the head tube isn't very long, and so it puts you in quite a well-balanced position compared to the long rear end. However, if you're a rider that is looking at the spec sheet thinking they're gonna have to swap that out immediately, it's worth experimenting with, because you might find it puts you in quite a good position. There is a flip chip here, which they say can help you between wheel sizes. However, it doesn't offer as much swing as something like the Ibis, for instance. And even if you did put a smaller rear wheel in there and ran it in the high mode, it would perhaps be slightly compromised in other key geometry dimensions. But that's it from our livability section. Let's go back to the review and get some verdicts.
Okay, we've chatted a lot about this bike in terms of setup, but ultimately pros and cons, what are they? Do you want to take it away with the negatives?
Yeah, do a little salad before dessert. I think we all found it wasn't the quietest frame on test. There was some cable rattle that was hard to address. I think some of us, you didn't, but I struggled, and I think Henry and Kaz a bit with frame balance, like fore aft, getting the suspension set up right. And then that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually all.
Fair enough. I mean, when you look at the bike, like it's fairly clean cut, so mechanically it's easy to work on. Like you can pull the shock off quickly. It's got the tube-in-tube cable management. And then we talked about the setup. You know, it can be tricky to get there, but it does give you a lot of options. The mixed wheels, the longer travel stroke on the shock.
Yeah.
And then it's a carbon frame. This is built pretty light as well. So
Yeah.
it's a good do it all arounder.
Yeah, and I think like my final pro with this bike is it remains, as the Sentinel always has been, kind of just this like easy, friendly bike. It's not too extreme in any one way. It just kind of like is neutral enough that you could make it into a lot of different things. I think there's some solid pros. Leads to the final question, who is this bike for?
I mean, definitely a wide variety of people. It's gonna take a little bit of setup to, you know, paint it into like two different corners. And then, you know, an enduro, like a hard charging rider, or somebody who wants a lighter setup for like all day missions.
Yeah, I think as always, the Sentinel is a jack of all trades, and maybe because of that, there isn't quite as high of a ceiling as some of the other bikes have. Like it won't be as high performance in one specific area, but you can make it into a bunch of different things. There you have it, that's the Transition Sentinel. Don't forget to subscribe because we have plenty more of these field test videos coming, and check out the articles on the homepage for more information.